She had hidden the bruises for 6 months. 6 months of high-neck blouses in summer heat. 6 months of learning exactly which angle of light swallowed what shouldn't be seen. 6 months of standing inside the office of the most feared man in the city, a man who destroyed people for a living, and never once letting him see what was happening to her at home. Until this morning. Until the collar slipped, and Damien Blackthorne looked up from his desk, and the world between them cracked straight down the middle. If you've ever had to hide something that was breaking you, stay with me until the end of this story. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain had been coming down since before dawn. By the time Elena Hartwell stepped off the elevator on the 43rd floor of Blackthorne Global Tower, her shoes were soaked through, her umbrella had turned inside out somewhere on Fifth Avenue, and the concealer she'd applied 3 times that morning was already starting to lose the argument with her skin. She could feel it, that slight tightness along her jaw where the bruise sat deepest, where the pressure of foundation over raw tissue created a texture that wasn't quite right under direct light. She knew the lighting in the executive corridor better than she knew her own apartment, knew where the overhead panels hit hardest, knew which stretch of hallway between the elevator bank and Damien's office door ran warm and forgiving, and which stretch ran cold and clinical and exposed everything. She had mapped this building the way a woman maps any environment she isn't safe in, not consciously, not with intention, but with the body's oldest instinct: survival. The morning rush was already moving. Assistants carried tablets and coffee cups. Analysts walked fast with their heads down, and the 2 men from Damien's private security detail stood at their usual positions flanking the main corridor entrance like decorative pillars that could break your arm if you looked at them wrong. Elena nodded to both without stopping. Marcus gave her the standard chin lift. The other one, Reeves, newer, still learning the rhythms of the floor, gave her a slightly too long look that she cataloged and dismissed. She had learned to catalog everything. Her desk sat 12 feet from Damien's office door. It was a deliberately chosen position, far enough to give the impression of independence, close enough that he could see her through the glass partition whenever he chose to look. She had understood the architecture of that arrangement from her first week. Everything in this building was a power statement, her desk placement included. She set down her bag, pulled out her laptop, and opened the morning schedule with the focused efficiency that had kept her employed for 6 months, in a job where 3 assistants before her had lasted a combined total of 4 months. She was good at this. Genuinely, technically good. Not just at managing calendars and filtering communications and translating Damien's curt, abbreviated instructions into actionable directives for a staff of 60 plus, but at the particular skill of reading a room before the room knew it was being read, at anticipating needs before they became demands, at making herself useful enough to be indispensable and unobtrusive enough to be invisible. Invisibility had always been the goal. The morning moved the way mornings in this office usually moved, fast and slightly pressurized, like the building itself was breathing at a controlled, elevated rate. She fielded 11 emails before 8:30, rescheduled a board call that had collapsed overnight due to a conflict with the Singapore office, and confirmed the car service for Damien's 2 o'clock at the Federal Building downtown. The coffee arrived from the kitchen at 8:52, 3 minutes late, and she made a note to follow up with catering about the morning timeline, because Damien noticed things like that even when he said nothing, and the silence after noticing was worse than the comment. She was reaching across her desk for the printed briefing packet when the office door opened. She didn't look up, didn't need to. She knew his footsteps, the particular weight and rhythm of them, measured and unhurried, the walk of someone who had never once in his adult life needed to rush, because rooms adjusted to him, not the other way around. "Briefing's on your desk," she said. "Singapore confirmed for 9:15. The Mercer contracts came in overnight. I flagged 3 clauses legal is going to push back on. Notes are in the margin. Your 2 o'clock has been moved to the building's east entrance because of the protest on Monroe." She still hadn't looked up. That was the arrangement, the unspoken rhythm they'd settled into. She spoke, he absorbed, he moved on. It worked because it was efficient, and efficiency was the one language they shared fluently. But he didn't move on. She felt it before she registered it consciously. The absence of his footsteps continuing, the stillness where motion should have been. She glanced up out of reflex. Damien Blackthorne was standing 4 feet from her desk, not moving toward his office, not reaching for the briefing packet she'd angled toward his side of the partition. He was 34 years old and looked it in the way that men who have spent their lives under pressure look their age. Not soft, not lined exactly, but settled into themselves with a density that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what they'd done with the years they'd been given. He was not conventionally handsome in the way magazines printed. He was the other kind, the kind that made people look twice because something in the composition of his face suggested a history that hadn't been gentle, and the brain processed that before it processed anything else. I was looking at her neck. Elena felt the cold go through her before the thought fully formed. Her left hand moved, involuntary, half a second too late, to her collar. But the collar had already shifted during her commute, during the umbrella disaster on Fifth Avenue, and the neckline of her blouse had slipped 2 inches below where it was supposed to sit. She fixed it. He had already seen. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. 4 seconds of Damien Blackthorne standing completely still, his expression doing the thing it did when he was processing something he hadn't been given in the briefing. That flat, controlled containment that could mean almost anything except nothing, because Damien Blackthorne's face never meant nothing. Elena. His voice was low, not soft. Damien's voice was never soft. It was just sometimes quieter, which was its own different thing. Quiet the way the room before a verdict was quiet. The Mercer clauses are on page 4, she said. Her own voice came out clean and level, and she was proud of that. Weeks of practice. Years, really. I can walk you through them before the Singapore call if you want. Look at me. She was already looking at him. She knew what he meant. I'm fine, she said. You're not. The Singapore call is in 18 minutes. I know when my calls are. She held his gaze and felt the specific exhaustion of this, of maintaining the performance under direct observation, of smiling with the eyes when the face below the eyes was doing its own separate, traitorous thing. She had gotten good at this performance. Exceptional, even. But there was something about the way Damien looked at people that had always unsettled her. Not aggressive, not invasive exactly, but with a completeness of attention that made the usual deflections feel inadequate, like trying to redirect a searchlight with a hand mirror. It's nothing, she said. Who? Not a question. The word landed flat and certain, the way his words usually landed, like he'd already run the calculation and was simply reading the result aloud. Damien, I'm not asking about the Singapore call. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done any of the things that men did when they wanted to make you feel small or cornered, and somehow that restraint was more unnerving than the alternative would have been. I'm asking who put that bruise on your neck. Elena set down the pen she'd been holding without realizing she was holding it. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at them for a moment. Her knuckles, the faint ink stain on her right index finger from the briefing packet, the small silver ring on her left hand that had belonged to her grandmother and that she never took off because it was the one thing in her life that had lasted. It's a personal matter, she said. It doesn't affect my work. I didn't ask if it affected your work. Then I don't see why it's Elena. Just her name again, that quiet, that completeness. I've had 3 assistants in 4 years. You're the first one who hasn't quit or had to be let go. You know why? She said nothing. Because you're the only one who has ever actually given a damn about the work. Not the proximity to power, not the salary, the actual work. He paused. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Who? The rain hammered the glass behind her. 43 floors below, the city went about its life. She could hear the distant muffled wail of a siren, rising and falling and fading. My mother's boyfriend, she said. The words came out flat. She had practiced saying them, in the shower, in the dark of her apartment, in the hollow space between waking up and getting up. And they still felt strange in her mouth, like a word in a language she hadn't fully learned yet. His name is Carl Whitmore. He's been with my mother for 3 years. The silence that followed was different from the first one, heavier, more deliberate. He hits her, Damien said. He hits both of us. She kept her hands folded, kept her voice level. This was the version she had rehearsed, the calm, factual account that didn't ask for anything, didn't bleed on the furniture. When I'm not there, it's worse for her, so I stay close. I live 12 minutes from her apartment. I answer her calls at 2 in the morning, and She stopped, breathed once. I get in the way when I have to. And last night you had to. 3 days ago. She glanced at her collar again, a reflex. It looked worse then. Damien said nothing. She could feel him thinking, Not the surface thinking of someone reacting, but the deeper kind, the kind she'd observed in him during negotiations, when the other side said something that rearranged his strategy, and he needed 4 seconds to rebuild it from the foundation up, without letting on that anything had shifted. "I can handle it," she said before he could speak. "I'm not telling you this because I need you to do anything. I'm telling you because you asked, and because—" She made a small gesture that wasn't quite a shrug. "Because lying to you directly feels worse than telling you the truth." "That's interesting," he said, in a tone that suggested it actually was. "Damien, I don't need—" "I know what you need," he said. "And I know what you're about to say next, so I'll save you the trouble. You're going to tell me you don't want to be anyone's problem. You're going to tell me you've handled this alone for a long time, and you know how to keep handling it. And you're going to tell me that you're afraid of what a man like me does when he decides to solve a problem." He paused. "Am I wrong?" The rain against the glass, the distant sirens, the way the room felt slightly tilted on its axis, like the 43rd floor had shifted an inch to the left while she wasn't paying attention. "No," she said quietly. "You're not wrong." He held her gaze for another moment, then turned and walked into his office. She heard the briefing packet slide across his desk, heard the click of his chair. 18 minutes, he said, through the open door. "Let's not keep Singapore waiting." Elena pulled up the conference call interface on her laptop and breathed, slowly, deliberately, the way she'd learned to breathe when the body was doing one thing and the face was required to do another. The Singapore call lasted 40 minutes. During it, she took notes with the same precision she always did, flagged 3 action items, and said exactly 12 words out loud. Damien conducted the call in the clipped exact way he conducted all negotiations, with the patience of someone who knew he had the leverage and therefore had no need to perform urgency. She watched him through the glass partition and thought about what he'd said, and about what he hadn't said, and about the particular silence that had followed her admission, which had felt less like the silence of a man computing how to exploit information and more like the silence of a man who had been handed something fragile and was deciding how to hold it. She didn't know what to do with that. After the call ended, he called her into the office. She stood in front of his desk with her tablet and waited. He was looking at something on his laptop, and he let the moment stretch. Not cruelly, just with the habitual ease of a man who had never been told that making people wait was impolite, and had therefore never felt the need to rush. "Roman Voss," he said, "your security chief. He's going to be available to you, starting today." She felt something cold move through her. "Damien, not as a watchdog," he said, still looking at the laptop. "Available, if you need him. I don't need a bodyguard. Carl he's not organized crime, he's not—" "I know what he is." He looked up. "He's a man who hits women and has been doing it without consequence because the women around him have been surviving instead of fighting back. Which is not a criticism." He said the last part without inflection, just placing it in the record. "Roman's number will be in your phone by noon. You don't have to use it, but it'll be there." She stood in the doorway of the most powerful man she'd ever been in a room with, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not gratitude, exactly. Not yet. Because gratitude required trust and trust required time, and she had neither in reliable supply. What she felt was something more complicated, something like the vertigo of a door opening in a wall she had assumed was solid. "Thank you," she said, because it was what you said. "The Mercer contracts," he replied. "You said 3 clauses." And like that, the conversation was over. She went back to her desk. Roman Voss was not what she'd expected, which, she was beginning to understand, was a pattern with people connected to Damien Blackthorne. She had expected Roman to be the blunt instrument, large, humorless, communicating primarily through physical presence. He was large, certainly, but the first time he appeared at the edge of her field of vision, outside her mother's apartment building on a Tuesday evening when she'd gone to check on Margaret after a call that had lasted 1 ring and gone to voicemail. He was eating a hot dog from the cart on the corner and reading something on his phone with the detached patience of a man who had learned to wait without visibly waiting. He nodded to her once. She stopped walking. "How long have you been here?" "Couple hours." "Did Damien send you?" Roman gave her a look that suggested the answer was self-evident, and that he preferred not to waste words confirming things that were already obvious. He took another bite of the hot dog. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "I know. I'm going to tell him to pull you. You can do that." He said it without aggression, without challenge, a simple acknowledgement. He'll probably reassign me to the door downstairs instead of here, but someone will be close. Elena looked at the entrance to her mother's building. The lobby light was the same yellow it had been for 3 years, always slightly flickering, always making everyone who entered look slightly ill. She'd complained to the super 4 times. He'd said he'd fix it 4 times. My mother doesn't know about any of this, she said. She won't hear it from me. Carl can't know there's security. If he thinks I've... She stopped, chose the words. If he thinks I've escalated this, he'll escalate back. He needs to feel like he's the most dangerous thing in the room. If he figures out that he's not, he won't figure it out. Roman finished the hot dog, folded the paper, and put it in the trash can 6 feet away with the accuracy of someone who'd made that exact motion 10,000 times. That's kind of the whole point. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she went upstairs. Her mother was fine. Fine in the specific way that Margaret Hartwell was always fine, which meant present and functional and performing a normalcy that required effort to maintain and that Elena could see through completely, but that they both agreed to honor because the alternative was having the conversation. And the conversation felt like the edge of something neither of them was ready to fall off. Carl was not there. He came back 2 hours later, and Elena stayed, and nothing happened. He was charming in the way that men like Carl were charming when audiences were present. Easy laugh, loose posture, the practiced warmth of someone who understood that the performance had to be convincing or the whole structure collapsed. He made coffee without being asked. He told a story about his coworker that wasn't particularly funny, but that he delivered with enough energy that it almost was. Elena watched him the whole time with the patient, documenting attention she usually reserved for difficult contracts. She stayed until 10 and then took a cab home. When she passed the corner near her mother's building, the trash can Roman had used was still there. The hot dog wrapper was gone. None. The weeks that followed moved in a strange double rhythm. At the office, things were the same and not the same. The work continued in its precise, demanding way. The contracts, the calls, the endless management of Damien's schedule and communications, and the 60-odd people whose professional lives intersected daily with his. She was good at it. She remained good at it. But there was something different in the room between them now, something that hadn't been there before the collar had slipped, and the 6 months of careful architecture had developed a crack. He didn't mention it again. Not directly. He was too intelligent to press, and she was starting to suspect, too genuinely measured in some fundamental way that his public reputation had never accounted for. What people understood about Damien Blackthorne was his willingness to destroy what needed destroying. What they didn't account for was the patience, the specific quality of restraint that she had started to recognize as structural, not strategic, not a tactic he employed to seem measured, but an actual discipline, the kind that had been built over time and at cost. One morning she came in to find a single white orchid on her desk. No note. The building's reception wouldn't have put it there. Wrong floor, wrong protocol. She looked at it for a moment, then set her bag down and opened her laptop without comment. 3 days later, she found a salary adjustment in her employee portal. Retroactive by 90 days, 11%, no accompanying email. She went to his door. "You don't have to do that," she said. He looked up. "Do what?" "The raise, the flower." He held her gaze with that complete, unhurried attention that she'd stopped finding merely unsettling and started finding something else that she didn't have a name for yet. "You haven't taken a sick day in 6 months," he said. "You came in with a broken umbrella and soaked shoes on the worst rain day this city's had in October, and you had Mercer flagged before 9. The raise is 6 months overdue." He paused. "The orchid is because you said once that your desk never gets any natural light, and it bothered you." She was quiet for a moment. "I said that in passing," she said, 8 weeks ago, in a 2-sentence conversation about the window blinds." "I know." She stood there in the doorway and felt the vertigo again. That sensation of a door opening in a wall she'd assumed was solid, revealing not the threat she'd been braced for, but something quieter, and in its own way, more unsettling. "Thank you," she said again. "Mercer's calling at 3, he replied. "They've come back on 2 of the 3 clauses. Tell legal to hold." October turned raw and gray, the city pulling inward the way it did when the cold settled in seriously, everyone's shoulders rising, the pace on the sidewalk shortening and quickening. Elena moved through it the way she moved through everything, efficiently, attentively, with the low-grade alertness that had become so habitual she barely noticed it anymore. Carl had been quiet for 3 weeks. This was not reassuring. Men like Carl went quiet the way weather systems went quiet. Not because the pressure had resolved, but because it was building towards something. She knew this. She had grown up knowing this. The call came on a Wednesday night at 11:47. Her mother's number. One ring, gone to voicemail. Elena was already out of bed and reaching for her coat before the second attempt came through. Margaret's voice was thin and controlled, the careful control of someone performing calm to avoid escalating a situation that was already escalating. "I'm fine," she said, which Elena had learned to translate accurately. "I'm not fine, and something has happened, and I'm trying to protect you from knowing the degree of it." "I'm coming," Elena said. "You don't need to." "I'm coming." The cab took 9 minutes. She paid with her card and didn't wait for the receipt. The lobby light was still flickering yellow. She took the stairs because the elevator was slow, and her body had made the decision before her mind caught up to it. She heard it from the third-floor landing. Not words, just the specific register of Carl's voice when the performance was gone. Low and flat and relentless. She pushed through the stairwell door and walked down the hall and put her key in the lock the way she'd been putting that key in that lock for 3 years, and she opened the door, and her mother was standing against the far wall with her arms crossed tight over her chest and her eyes doing the thing they did. That careful blank distance, the managed absence that was its own form of survival. And Carl was in the center of the room looking at Elena with the eyes of a man whose evening had just taken the turn he'd been hoping for. "There she is," he said. Elena stayed in the doorway. "Mom, get your coat." "She's not going anywhere," Carl said it easily. No heat yet, just the casual establishment of fact that was how it always started. "We're having a family conversation. I'm not family. Close enough." He smiled. Not at her. Through her. "You want to know what your mother told me tonight? She told me she's been talking to someone, thinking about making changes." He made a small sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite contempt. Something in between. Interesting timing. Elena looked at her mother. Margaret's eyes moved to hers for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction Elena read everything. The conversation that had happened before this one, the decision her mother had begun to make, the courage it had taken, and the cost it had immediately incurred. "Mom," Elena said, "coat, now." "She said I told you," Carl said, taking one step. Not toward Elena. That came later. Toward the center of the room, which was his declaration that the room belonged to him. "I think we should talk about boundaries, about what happens when people share things they shouldn't." "Don't," Elena said. "Or what?" His eyes moved to hers, and the easiness in them was almost gone now, just the flat patience underneath it. "You'll call someone? You'll go to the police?" He said the last word with a specific inflection. Not quite contempt, just certainty. The certainty of a man who had been reported twice and charged 0 times and understood exactly what that math meant for his future. "Who's going to—" Her phone rang. Not a call. A text. She looked at it because she always looked at incoming texts at 11 at night, because incoming texts at 11 at night were always about her mother. The text was from a number she'd saved as RV 6 weeks ago and used twice. Building. Say the word. She looked up at Carl. At her mother against the wall. At the small flickering kitchen light that cast everything in the same yellow as the lobby downstairs. And the smell of old coffee and tension and 3 years of a life compressed into a 2-bedroom apartment that her mother had decorated with the specific hopeful care of someone who wanted to believe the space reflected something better than what happened in it. She thought about what Damien had told her. "I know what he is." She thought about what she'd told Damien. "I don't need—" She typed one word. "Yes." 30 seconds later she heard the sound of the stairwell door at the end of the hall, and the measured, unhurried footsteps of a man who had never needed to rush because he was always already the most dangerous thing in the room. Carl heard it too. She watched his face recalibrate. Not panic, not yet, but the first flicker of a man whose math was suddenly changing. The knock on the open door was quiet. Polite, almost. Roman Voss filled the doorframe and looked at Carl with the specific, patient attention of someone examining a problem that was already solved and was simply waiting to be formalized. "Evening," Roman said. Carl's easy smile came back. The performance, still reaching for purchase. "Who the hell are you?" "A friend of the family," Roman said. He looked at Elena without looking away from Carl, which was a skill Elena filed away for later. "Ms. Hartwell, why don't you and your mother take a walk?" Elena moved to her mother. took her arm, felt Margaret's hand grip her wrist with the sudden, desperate strength of someone who has been holding themselves very still for a long time and has finally been given permission to move. They went into this hallway. Elena pulled the door halfway shut. She heard Carl say something, the charm finally curdling, the edges coming in, a man whose performance had been interrupted for the last time beginning to understand that the geometry of the room had changed fundamentally. She heard Roman's voice. Quiet, level, patient. She didn't hear words, she didn't need to. In the yellow flicker of the hallway light, her mother pressed her forehead against Elena's shoulder and didn't cry, because Margaret Hartwell had spent 30 years learning that crying was a luxury, and the body hadn't unlearned it yet. But her grip on Elena's arm didn't loosen, and Elena held on back, and they stood in the hallway of an apartment building in a city that was going about its life 43 floors below the place where everything had already begun to change. Her phone buzzed. Not Roman. Another number. Is she all right? Elena stared at Damien's text for a long moment. Outside, rain had started again. She could hear it against the hallway window, light and persistent, the kind that comes in sideways. She thought about the orchid on her desk, the raise she hadn't asked for, the way he'd said I know when she'd told him she'd mentioned the window light in passing 8 weeks ago, in a conversation he had no professional reason to remember. She thought about the wall with the door in it. She thought about how much it cost to trust someone, how long it took to learn that cost, how she'd been paying it her whole life and had gotten very good at calculating the interest before she ever agreed to borrow anything. She typed back, "She will be." Then, after a moment, she typed, "Thank you." She watched the small indicator that showed he'd read it. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Down the hall, she heard the sound of the apartment door opening. Roman's footsteps. Carl's voice. Not dangerous anymore, just diminished. The sound of a man who had measured the room wrong and was being very carefully shown the exit. Margaret lifted her head from Elena's shoulder. Her eyes were dry, but her face had the particular exhaustion of someone who has just put down something very heavy. Not all the way down, not permanently, but low enough to feel the difference. "Who is he?" Margaret asked. Meaning Roman. "Someone who works with my boss," Elena said. Her mother was quiet for a moment, then, "Your boss?" "Yes." "He sent someone?" "Yes." Margaret looked at the apartment door, at Roman, now in the hallway, at Carl, moving past him toward the elevator with the hunched posture of a man whose evening had collapsed into something he hadn't anticipated and wasn't finished processing. She watched him go with the careful, absolute attention of someone memorizing an exit, making sure it was real, that it was happening, that the space he was leaving was actually becoming empty. Then she looked at Elena. "What kind of man does that?" she said. "Send someone at midnight without being asked." Elena thought about the question, about the 34-year-old man 43 floors up, who ran a criminal empire and remembered a 2-sentence conversation about window light 8 weeks after the fact, about the wall with the door. "I'm still figuring that out," she said. She meant it as a simple answer, a provisional one. She didn't know, standing in that yellow flickering hallway at 12 minutes past midnight with her mother's hand still gripping her arm and the rain coming in sideways against the window, that the process of figuring it out would cost her something she hadn't planned on giving, and that she would end up grateful for the price. Down the hall, the elevator dinged. Carl stepped in without looking back. Roman watched the doors close, then turned to them. His expression was the expression of a man who had seen this particular situation in enough variations that none of them surprised him anymore, but who had not yet learned to be indifferent to it, which Elena suspected was the quality that made him good at his job. "All clear," he said. Margaret nodded. Then she turned and walked back into her apartment with the slow, deliberate step of a woman who was beginning, just beginning, to understand that the shape of a room could change. Elena stayed in the hallway a moment longer. She looked at her phone, at the 2 words she'd sent Damien, at the absence of his reply, which was not absence the way silence was usually absence, not empty or withheld, but simply the reply of a man who understood that some things were answered by action and didn't need to be answered twice. She put the phone in her pocket. She went back inside. For the first time in 6 months, she slept through the night. She arrived at the office the next morning with dry shoes and the collar of her blouse where the collar of her blouse was supposed to be. She set down her bag, opened her laptop, pulled up the morning schedule. At 8:54, 2 minutes ahead of the usual timing, the coffee arrived from the kitchen. She looked at the small card tucked under the cup. Building catering didn't put cards under cups. That wasn't protocol. The card said, Singapore moved to 10. You have until 9:45, nothing else. His handwriting, blocky and precise, the handwriting of a man who had learned to make his marks definitive. She folded the card and put it in the inner pocket of her bag, next to the small silver ring she'd put there for safekeeping during the cab ride last night, and had forgotten to move back to her finger. She put the ring back on. She looked through the glass partition. Damien was already at his desk, reading something. The city spread out gray and rain-washed behind him like a painted backdrop. He didn't look up. But in the exact moment she looked away, she could have sworn, she would have bet everything she had, that the corner of his mouth moved. What Elena Hartwell did not know, sitting at her desk on a rain-washed Thursday morning with dry shoes and a ring back on her finger, and one night of uninterrupted sleep under her belt for the first time in half a year, was that Carl Whitmore had not gone quietly into the night. What she didn't know was that he had made 3 phone calls from the parking garage of her mother's building at 12:22 in the morning, and that 2 of those calls had been answered, and that the man on the other end of the second call had a connection to a name that connected, through 2 careful removes, to Damien Blackthorne's business, and that Carl Whitmore, who was not organized crime and had never claimed to be, had just become something significantly more complicated than a man who hit women. She didn't know any of that, yet. 3 days after Roman Voss walked Carl Whitmore out of Margaret Hartwell's apartment building, a bouquet of yellow tulips appeared outside Margaret's door. No card. No name. Margaret called Elena at 7 in the morning, voice careful and flat, in the way it got when she was trying not to assign meaning to something before she understood it. There are flowers, she said. I see them, Elena said, though she was 40 minutes away and hadn't seen anything. She meant, I know where they came from. Yellow ones. I'll call you back. She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed in the gray early light, and looked at her phone and thought about the card under the coffee cup, and the salary adjustment, and the orchid, and the fact that Damien Blackthorne had apparently decided to conduct his feelings, if that was what they were. If she was even reading this correctly, which she was not certain of, through a sustained campaign of anonymous practical gestures that a person could, if she chose, interpret as nothing more than the professional courtesies of an employer who was thorough about everything. She could interpret it that way. She was choosing, for now, to interpret it that way. She got dressed and went to work. The morning was ordinary until 10:43, when Marcus appeared in the doorway of her workspace with the specific posture of a man delivering information he had not been asked to deliver and was doing so anyway because the alternative was worse. Whitmore filed a harassment complaint, he said, against you, against Roman. He's claiming unlawful entry and intimidation. Elena set down her pen. He was in my mother's apartment. I know. Roman knocked. I know that too. Marcus's expression did not change. It rarely did. The complaint was filed through a lawyer, Moretti and Associates. The name registered a half-second before the implication did. Elena looked up. That's Damien's lawyer, she said. One of the firms he uses. Yes. Marcus was watching her with the careful attention of someone measuring a reaction. Whitmore found the connection somehow. Either he looked it up or someone told him. He's using it to suggest that Damien personally orchestrated the removal, which changes the legal exposure. Roman isn't employed by Damien in any official. He is, actually, on paper. That's the problem. She stood up, moved to Damien's door without knocking, a thing she almost never did, and pushed it open. He was on the phone. He looked at her face and said into the receiver, I'll call you back, and set it down. You heard, she said, 20 minutes ago. You should have told me. He looked at her steadily. I was handling it. It's my mother. It's my situation. You don't get to handle it without... She stopped, breathed, reset. She was doing the thing she did when the anger came up faster than the reasoning, and she needed 3 seconds to let the reasoning catch up. You should have told me, she said again, quieter this time. More controlled, less clean. You're right, he said. She hadn't expected that. The agreement, offered without qualification, without the defensive cushioning that most people wrapped around admissions. Just, you're right, flat and direct and meaning it. She stood in the doorway and felt the anger drain slightly, and felt annoyed about the draining. Moretti can handle the complaint, Damien said. It won't go anywhere. Whitmore doesn't have standing. Roman was invited by a resident of the building, the door was open, and there was no physical contact. The intimidation angle is entirely subjective and based on Roman's size, which is not a legal liability. He paused. The harder issue is the connection to me. If Whitmore's lawyer decides to dig into why Roman Voss was there, the story gets complicated. Complicated how? Complicated in ways that could pull your name into something you don't want to be in the middle of. He said it without drama, just the clear statement of a problem that existed and had weight. My business interests are not clean, Elena. You know that. You've managed my schedule for 6 months. You know what some of those meetings are. She did know. She had known from the third week, had catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, and had made the decision, conscious, deliberate, that her job was to do her job, and that the moral accounting of Damien Blackthorne's business practices was not hers to perform and not her place to perform it from. But knowing and hearing it said aloud were different things. What are you telling me? She said. I'm telling you that if this complaint escalates and your name is connected to mine in a legal filing, it's going to draw attention to you that you don't want. He held her gaze. I'm also telling you that I should have been more careful. I moved too fast. I put Roman in place without thinking through the exposure. You were trying to help. I was. He said it without apology and without defensiveness, which was its own strange kind of honesty. That doesn't make the risk disappear. She looked at him across the desk. The city behind him in the gray October light, the files stacked with their specific Damien-ordered precision, the single-framed photograph on the credenza behind him that she had looked at 100 times and never asked about. A man and a boy on a dock somewhere. The man's hand on the boy's shoulder, neither of them looking at the camera. Handle the complaint, she said. But tell me next time. Yes, he said. She went back to her desk. The next week was bad in the quiet way that bad weeks often were. Not dramatic, not operatic, just the accumulation of small pressures that didn't individually justify alarm but collectively created the sensation of a tightening. Carl was quiet. Whitmore's lawyer sent one follow-up letter through Moretti, which Moretti's office returned with 3 paragraphs that apparently resolved the matter because nothing further arrived. Roman remained in rotation, less visible now, pulling back from direct proximity to Margaret's building in the interest of not providing Whitmore with further photographic evidence of anything. Margaret called every 2 days. Always fine. Always performing fine. Elena listened to the fine and tried to hear the texture underneath it. At the office, she and Damien moved through their days with the specific careful choreography of 2 people who had said something true to each other and were now navigating what that truth changed about the room. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible to anyone looking in. But the quality of the air was different. The 12 feet between her desk and his door felt like a different 12 feet than they'd been 6 months ago. He brought her coffee one morning. From the kitchen himself, not through the catering system. Set it on her desk while she was on a call, and left before she could say anything. She stared at the cup for 10 seconds after the call ended. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't acknowledge having done it. She was beginning to understand how Damien Blackthorne communicated things he had decided not to say directly, through the doing of things, through the showing up. She found this both less threatening and more threatening than the alternative would have been, and she couldn't fully explain why, except that words were things a person could dismiss or deflect or reinterpret, and actions just sat there, solid and witnessed, requiring the body to decide what to do with them. She didn't know what to do with them. She filed them, cataloged them, kept them in the part of her mind that she hadn't decided what to do with yet. The Mercer deal closed on a Thursday. It was a significant close, the kind that warranted the brief but genuine acknowledgement that moved through the office like a change in barometric pressure, people straightening their spines slightly, speaking a half step more confidently. Elena had worked on the supporting documentation for 11 weeks. The 3 clauses she'd flagged in October had been the right 3 clauses. Legal had come back to her personally, which they never did, to say that her notes had saved the company a material exposure. She was at her desk at 6:15 that evening, after everyone had gone, finishing the closeout filing. The office was quiet in that particular after-hours way. The HVAC humming, the city sounds 43 floors down, the overhead panels on their automated dim setting. She heard his door open. "You should go home," Damien said. 5 minutes. He didn't go back inside. She heard him move, not to her desk, just into the space, and she had the sense of him leaning against the partition, the way he sometimes did in the late evenings when the building was empty, and the performance that both of them maintained during the operating day was less necessary. "You didn't have to flag those clauses," he said. "Most people would have passed them through and let legal catch them if they caught them. You went through the whole contract at 7 in the morning with soaked shoes. It's my job. Above your job description. My job description is whatever needs doing." She saved the file, closed the laptop. "You know that. It's why you kept me." "Partly." He paused. "Partly I kept you because you're the only person who has ever worked in this office who doesn't want something from me." She looked up. I was leaning against the glass partition with his arms crossed, jacket gone, sleeves rolled to the forearm, in the way they got at the end of long days, and he was looking at her with that complete attention that she'd long since stopped trying to find unsettling, and had started simply accepting as a feature of how he moved through the world. "Everyone wants something from you," she said. "You know what I mean." She did. "I want my salary and my health insurance and to do good work," she said. "Those aren't the same category." "No," he agreed, "they're not." The city hummed below them. The HVAC cycled. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator dinged. "My father built this company," he said, not as preamble to anything, just as a statement that had apparently decided it needed to be in the air. Not the charitable arm, not the legitimate structures, the actual thing, what it runs on. He looked at his hands, the slight roughness of his knuckles that she'd noticed in their first week, and filed away. "I took it over at 26. I thought I could change the architecture, keep the revenue, redirect the method. That's a very—" He stopped. A rare hesitation. "That's a young man's idea. Did you?" "Some of it." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Less than I planned. More than my father would have." She looked at him sitting half in the ambient light of the city, coming through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and thought about what it cost to say that to someone. What it required to make that specific accounting allowed. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you work 12 feet from my office, and you've never asked." His eyes stayed on hers. "I thought you deserved to have the information you were already mostly aware of made explicit. So I can make an informed decision. So you can make whatever decision you want to make." She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it, the specific honesty, the way it didn't ask anything of her in return, didn't request forgiveness or understanding or continuation. Just placed the truth on the desk between them and left it there. "I've already made most of my decisions," she said finally. "I know." He pushed off the partition, picked up the jacket from the back of his chair. "Go home, Elena." She went home. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and told herself very firmly that she was not falling for her employer, that this was the kind of thinking that ended careers and created situations, and that the smartest thing she had ever done in a life that had required a great deal of smart things was to be very, very careful about where she put her trust. She was very firm about all of this. She slept badly. Margaret called at 6:43 the following Tuesday. Not one ring, multiple rings. Connected. But it wasn't Margaret's voice, it was Carl. "She's fine," he said, which was the most terrifying opening of any sentence she had ever heard, because people only prefaced information with "she's fine" when the next information would suggest otherwise. "She had a fall. Put her on. She's resting." "Carl." The cold came through her body like a current. "Put my mother on the phone." A pause. The particular pause of a man recalculating whether the performance was necessary or whether he could drop it. "She doesn't want to talk right now." Elena was already putting on her coat. "Tell her I'm coming," Elena said, "and tell her I'm bringing someone." She hung up. She called Roman. He answered on the second ring. She didn't explain. She gave him the address and said the word she'd used in the text 3 weeks ago, the one that had brought him to the hallway within 30 seconds, and he said 15 minutes and ended the call. She called Damien. She did this without premeditation, without running the logic of it through the usual filters, with the same instinct that had made her text Roman that night. The body's understanding, faster than the mind's, of who was in the room and what the room needed. He answered immediately. "Carl has my mother," she said. "He's calling it a fall." A single beat of silence. Not hesitation, processing. She'd learned to distinguish the two. "Roman?" he said. Called. "I'll meet you there." "You don't have to." "I'll meet you there." The same flatness as always, the same certainty. Not a promise performed for effect, but a simple declaration of a fact that was already in motion. She took the stairs down from her apartment to the lobby because the elevator was too slow and her body needed to be moving, and the movement helped her think. The cab was at the curb in 4 minutes. The driver asked her twice if she was all right, and she said yes both times and meant it less each time. 12 minutes of lights and rain-slicked streets. The building. The lobby. Yellow light still flickering. Still. She didn't wait for the elevator this time either. She had her key out before she reached the door. She heard voices inside. Carl's voice. Not raised, which was almost worse. The controlled version. The performance. And underneath it, her mother's voice, quiet and careful, and doing the thing, doing the managed distance thing, the thing Elena had watched Margaret do for 3 years, and that never stopped costing her something even when it looked like nothing. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. Margaret was on the couch with an ice pack against her wrist. Not her face. The wrist, which meant it had happened during a reach or a grab, which meant she had tried to leave or tried to put something between them, which meant this had not been an incidental thing. Carl stood near the kitchen doorway in his house clothes with a glass of water, easy as furniture, looking at Elena with the eyes of a man who had been expecting her. "I told you she's fine," he said. "Mom." Elena crossed to the couch without looking at Carl again, knelt in front of her mother, took in Margaret's face, the careful composure, the exhaustion underneath it, the specific look in her eyes that was not absence this time, but something more alert, more present, something that had made a decision. "I'm fine," Margaret said. And then, quietly, with a steadiness that was new, that had not been in her voice 3 weeks ago in this same apartment, "I told him tonight that I want him to leave." The air in the room changed. Carl set the water glass down on the counter with a small, precise click. "We've been talking it through," he said to Elena, as if she'd asked him to characterize the situation. "This is a private family." "She told you to leave," Elena said. She still wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her mother, at the ice pack on the wrist, at the steadiness in Margaret's eyes that was costing Margaret something to maintain. "That means it's not a conversation anymore. I live here. Your name isn't on the lease." A pause. Then, "Your little security friend isn't going to show up this time." His voice had shed another layer of performance, getting to the flat part faster now. "I made sure of that." Elena felt the cold run through her again, but differently this time. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that had been sitting at the base of her chest for 3 years and had finally run out of patience for pretending to be fear. She stood up. She looked at Carl Whitmore directly for the first time since she'd walked in, and she said very quietly, "What did you do?" He smiled. "The real one. The one that wasn't for audiences." "Had a conversation with a mutual acquaintance. Someone who knows your boss a little better than you do." He tilted his head. "Roman Voss isn't coming tonight. And your boss—" He said the word with the particular contempt of a man who needed to make someone smaller before he could feel large. "Your boss has a problem right now that's keeping him busy. Funny how that worked out." Elena's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. A text. 2 lines. She read it once. Then again. The words didn't change. Blackthorn Global under Federal Review. Inquiry opened this evening. Recommend you distance yourself from employer immediately. This is a courtesy. She looked up at Carl. He was watching her face with the careful attention of a man who had set something in motion and was waiting to see the results. "Who sent this?" she said. "I told you I know people." He shrugged. One shoulder. The practiced nonchalance of a man who had finally found a level of leverage he felt comfortable with. "All those months your boss has been protecting you, playing the night, sending his guys to my door." He made a small sound. "Turns out nights have exposed flanks too." The front door opened. Roman came through it. Elena saw Carl's expression flicker, the recalibration, the instant reassessment, and understood that whatever Carl had done, whatever conversation he'd had, it hadn't been enough. Or it hadn't worked. Or Damien had already anticipated it. Roman looked at Carl, at Elena, at the ice pack on Margaret's wrist. His expression did not change. But something in his posture shifted, the slight settling of a man who has just determined that the situation has defined itself, and he knows what he's doing now. "Mr. Whitmore," Roman said, "I need you to come with me." Carl laughed. It was not a comfortable laugh. "I don't think—" It's not a request. Roman looked at Elena. He'll be released once we've had a conversation. He won't be hurt. A pause. The honest kind, not the reassuring kind. Unless he makes it difficult. Carl looked at Elena, at his glass of water on the counter, at Roman standing between him and the door with the patient immovability of an object that had decided it was not moving. For a moment the room was perfectly still. Then the front door opened again. Damien Blackthorne walked in. I was wearing what he'd been wearing when she'd called him. The suit, the open collar, the particular bearing of a man who had come from somewhere fast without letting the fastness show. He scanned the room in one motion, took in Margaret on the couch, Carl near the kitchen, Elena standing between them. His eyes came to hers. She held up her phone. The text on the screen. He read it. His expression did not move. But something in the room moved, some quality of the air, some shift in the temperature of the space, the way a room changes when the person with the most actual power in it stops managing how much of that power is visible. He looked at Carl. Carl looked back at him. You made a phone call, Damien said. His voice was quiet, the quiet that was not soft. Carl said nothing. To Arthur Slade. Not a question. The flat reading of a result already calculated. Who called the federal contact he keeps for situations like this? Who opened an inquiry through a channel that should have cost you more than you have, which means Arthur Slade fronted it, which means you offered him something significant to do this as a favor. He paused. What did you offer him? Carl's performance was almost entirely gone now. What was left was the man underneath it, the calculation, the stubborn survival instinct, the refusal to show what the room had cost him. You can't prove any of that, Carl said. I don't need to prove it, Damien said. I need you to understand that you just made a decision with consequences that are significantly larger than the decision you thought you were making. He didn't raise his voice. You thought you were protecting your position in this apartment. What you actually did is make yourself a liability to Arthur Slade. And Arthur Slade does not carry liabilities. Elena watched Carl's face, watched the calculation run, watched the moment when he understood that the room he'd thought he'd set up, the exposed flank, the federal inquiry, the plan that was supposed to neutralize Damien and leave Carl holding the leverage, had instead placed him inside a structure controlled entirely by the man standing 6 feet away. You can't, Carl started. Go with Roman, Damien said. That's the only offer. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Elena counted them. Carl went with Roman. The door closed. Margaret sat on the couch with the ice pack on her wrist and looked at Damien Blackthorne standing in her apartment. This man she'd heard about in fragments, in Elena's careful, unsane way of referencing her employer, in the yellow tulips outside her door 3 days ago. And she didn't say anything, but she looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had spent 30 years measuring men against a standard that none of them had met, and who was doing that measuring now. Damien crossed the room, sat in the chair across from her. Let me see your wrist. Margaret looked at Elena. Elena nodded. Margaret held out her wrist. He looked at it. The professional, assessing look of a man who had seen this kind of injury before and was gauging degree, not performing concern. It's not broken, he said, but you should have it x-rayed tomorrow to be sure. I can arrange my own doctor, Margaret said. A beat. Then he said, yes, of course. They looked at each other, the 61-year-old woman who had survived 30 years by being very careful about who she let into her rooms, and the 34-year-old man who had built an empire on knowing when to press and when to wait. He waited. Elena says you're her boss, Margaret said. That's right. She's never brought anyone here. No. She doesn't let people in easily. I know. Margaret held his gaze with the steady, undeceivable attention of a woman whose life had given her an extremely accurate instrument for measuring the space between what people said and what they meant. What are you to her? She asked. The question sat in the room. Elena watched Damien's face, the fraction of a second before the answer, the place where a man's first honest impulse lives before the management of it catches up. He said, I'm working on that. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, something she'd been holding very carefully for a very long time, in the specific protective way you hold things that you're afraid of dropping. Her phone buzzed again, the unknown number. Another text. This one was different. 3 words. He has her. Elena stared at the screen. Her mind ran the grammar of it before she understood it. He, Her. And then she understood it, and the shift in her chest became something cold and specific and focused. She looked up. "Damien," she said. He was already looking at her. He read her face the way he read everything, completely, immediately, without the delay of uncertainty. "Who sent that?" he said. "Unknown number." She turned the phone so he could see. "Same one that sent the first text." He read it. The room went very still. "That's not about your mother," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." She looked at Margaret, at her mother sitting on the couch with an ice pack on her wrist, present and accounted for. Fine in the specific way that fine meant fine, which meant her was someone else. Damien was already on his phone. Elena stood in her mother's apartment at 12:41 in the morning and understood, with the clean, terrible clarity of something that could not be taken back, that Carl Whitmore had not been the problem. Carl Whitmore had been the distraction. The name came to Damien in under 90 seconds. Elena watched him work the phone. 2 calls, back to back. The second one in a language she didn't recognize, clipped and precise and over in 45 seconds. And she watched his face during those calls, the way it went through a series of almost imperceptible adjustments, the kind of micro-recalibrations she had learned to read over 6 months of sitting 12 feet from his door. He was not panicking. Damien Blackthorne did not panic. But something in the set of his jaw had changed, and whatever the voice on the second call told him had landed in his body before it reached his face, and the body didn't lie. He ended the call. He looked at her. "Who is she?" Elena said. "Her name is Claire Voss." The last name hit before the context did. Elena processed it in the half-second before Damien continued. "Roman's sister," he said. "She's 23. She lives in the Ridgeline district, works nights at a print shop on Callaway." A pause. The kind that carried weight. "She has nothing to do with any of this." Elena felt the shape of it assemble itself. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with the grinding, reluctant logic of something that had been true before she understood it, and was only now becoming visible. Carl Whitmore, who was not organized crime. Carl Whitmore, who had made phone calls from a parking garage at 12:22 in the morning. Carl Whitmore, who had offered Arthur Slade something significant enough to buy a federal inquiry as a favor. "He offered Slade Claire," she said. "Not a question." "Leverage," Damien said. "Roman is the one who walked him out 3 weeks ago. Roman is the one who's been visible." He set his phone face down on Margaret's kitchen counter and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who is performing the very specific calculation of what to do when the situation has escalated past the version he had planned for. "Slade holds Claire. Carl uses the threat of her to keep Roman from moving against him and to keep me occupied with the federal exposure while he stopped." Elena watched the next calculation run across his face, watched the moment it completed. "While he does what?" she said. Damien picked his phone back up. "Stay with your mother." "Damien?" "Elena." His voice had the quality it got in negotiations when the other side had made a move that was going to cost everyone in the room something, and he was done pretending otherwise. "I need you to stay with your mother. Roman is outside. Do not open this door for anyone who isn't him or me. Do you understand?" She understood. She understood, and she hated understanding, hated the particular helplessness of being the person required to stay behind, which was a thing she had been her entire life in one form or another and had never made peace with. "What is Slade going to do with her?" she said. "Nothing yet. She's leverage, not a target. The value is in the holding." He moved toward the door. "That changes if I don't respond correctly." "What's the correct response?" He stopped with his hand on the door frame. He looked back at her. The full look. Not the professional one, not the managed one, the one underneath those, the one she had been trying not to see clearly for 6 weeks because seeing it clearly would require her to decide what to do about it. "I'm going to need to make some decisions tonight," he said, "that aren't the kind of decisions I've been making lately." A pause. "I want you to know that before I make them." She held his gaze. "Come back," she said. It was all she said. He left. Margaret fell asleep on the couch at 2 in the morning, the ice pack long since gone warm and set aside, her breathing slow and even in the way of someone whose body had finally decided that the night was over, regardless of what was still happening in it. Elena sat in the chair across from her and looked at her mother's face. The fine lines around her eyes, the gray that had come into her hair over the last 3 years, the way sleep smoothed the careful composure away and left something younger and more exhausted in its place. She looked at her phone. Nothing from Damien, nothing from Roman. She sat with the silence and tried not to run the scenarios. At 3:17, Roman texted, "Claire is out. She's safe." Elena exhaled. The specific exhale of air that has been held in the chest at low pressure for hours. Not dramatically, just quietly, the body doing its accounting. She texted back, "Damien, 3 minutes." Then, "Working." She put the phone down. She looked at her mother sleeping and thought about what Damien had said in the doorway. Decisions that aren't the kind I've been making lately. She knew what that meant. She had worked 12 feet from his door for 6 months, and she understood the architecture of what he ran and the vocabulary of what those decisions involved. She had filed that knowledge carefully and deliberately in the part of herself that was good at not looking directly at things. She looked at it now. She looked at it, and she sat with the full weight of what it meant to be in this room, in this situation, with this man moving through a city doing things she couldn't see and couldn't stop. And she made herself feel the discomfort of that completely instead of at a managed distance. It was not comfortable. She stayed with it anyway. Well, he came back at 5:40. She heard the knock. Roman's knock, she recognized it now. And then Damien's voice, low, saying something she didn't catch. She opened the door. He looked like the end of a very long night, jacket gone somewhere. The left sleeve of his shirt was slightly torn at the shoulder seam. Not violently, just the way fabric tears when a body has been moving through spaces quickly and catching on things. His face was the face of a man who had done what he'd gone to do and was now in the particular aftermath of doing it, which was not regret exactly, but a kind of heaviness, a settling. He looked at her. "Your mother?" "Sleeping." "Good." He came in. Stood in the center of the room with the specific stillness of someone whose body is still running on adrenaline and has not yet gotten the message that it can stop. "It's handled." "How handled?" Slade released Claire. "She's with Roman." He sat down heavily in the chair Elena had occupied for the last 3 hours, put his elbows on his knees. "Slade is no longer in a position to pursue the federal exposure. The inquiry will be closed by end of week." "And Carl?" A pause. "Carl understands the situation," he said. "Damien." She sat across from him in her mother's spot. "What did you do?" He looked up at her, the full look again, unmanaged and direct, and in it she could see the cost of the night, not guilt. Damien Blackthorne did not have a simple relationship with guilt, but something more complex, something that acknowledged the nature of the choices made without pretending they had been made easily. "Nothing that can't be lived with," he said. "By me." A beat. "I kept my promise." "What promise?" "The one I've been making you for 6 months." His voice was quiet. The real quiet, not the strategic one. "I didn't become what hurt you. I had every reason to tonight. Slade gave me an opening, and I was angry enough to take it, and I—" He stopped, ran a hand across his jaw. "I didn't take it." The room was beginning to lighten at the edges, the first gray November dawn coming through the windows, the city below starting its early sounds. Margaret breathed steadily on the couch. Elena looked at Damien sitting in her mother's chair with his torn sleeve and his heavy face, and the specific, costly restraint of a man who had chosen something difficult when the easy thing was available, and she felt the wall, the one that had been developing a door in it for months, develop something more than a door. She felt it become optional. "Go sleep," she said. "My mother's couch pulls out. You're not driving across the city at 6 in the morning." He looked at the couch, at her mother on it. "I'll take the floor," he said. "Don't be ridiculous. Elena." "There's a blanket in the closet behind you," she said. "Second shelf." He was quiet for a moment, then he reached back and opened the closet door and found the blanket on the second shelf without further argument. She took the chair. They slept. It was the sound of the coffee machine that woke her, Margaret up before either of them, moving through the kitchen with the careful quiet of a woman trying not to wake her guests, which was its own kind of statement about what Margaret Hartwell thought of the situation she'd woken up to. Elena sat up in the chair. Her neck ached. The morning light was full and gray. On the floor near the far wall, Damien was awake. Had probably been awake, she suspected, for some time before the coffee machine, sitting with his back against the baseboard and his forearms on his knees, looking at nothing in particular. Margaret set 3 cups on the coffee table without comment. Damien sat up. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry for—" "Don't," Margaret said. She sat on the couch with her own cup and looked at him with the measuring eyes. My daughter slept in a chair because she wouldn't leave. You slept on my floor because she told you to. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I've had men in this apartment who wouldn't have done either of those things for anyone. Damien said nothing. He picked up his coffee. You're not what I expected, Margaret said. I've been told that. Is it a performance? Elena looked at her mother. Damien looked at Margaret. Some of it, he said. The dangerous parts aren't. Which parts aren't a performance? He thought about it. The actual thought, not the polished answer. The patience, he said finally. I learned that the hard way. Everything else I had to build. The patience was there from the beginning. I just had to learn to use it correctly. Margaret considered this, drank her coffee. Carl won't come back, she said. Not a question. No, Damien said. You're sure? Yes. Another silence. Then Margaret set her cup down and looked at Elena, with the look, the one that said she was about to say something that had been waiting and was tired of waiting. I've been afraid for so long, Margaret said, that I stopped being able to imagine what not being afraid would feel like. She looked at her wrist, the bruised one, resting in her lap. I want to try to imagine it now. Elena felt something crack open in her chest. Not painfully, but with the particular release of pressure that had been there for so long, she'd stopped registering it as pressure, and had started registering it as the permanent architecture of her interior life. She crossed to the couch and sat next to her mother and put her arm around her, and Margaret leaned into it the way she hadn't leaned into anything in 3 years. The weight of a woman finally putting something down. Damien looked at the window, the city, the gray November sky. He gave them the moment. He left at 8:30. He had calls to make. The machine of his life did not pause because the night had been what it had been, and he left with the efficiency of a man who knew how to move through a room without disrupting the temperature of it. At the door he paused and looked at Elena, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything. But the 12 feet of distance that had been their operating measurement for 6 months felt like a different 12 feet than it had ever been before. She went back to her mother's apartment. She helped Margaret sort through which of Carl's belongings were in fact Carl's, and which had migrated into shared spaces the way men's things always migrated. The creeping colonization of shelves and drawers that Elena had always found an accurate representation of how the rest of the occupation worked. It was almost ordinary, almost fine. Her phone rang at 11:42. Unknown number. But different. Not the burner texture of the number that had texted her twice in the night. A real line. Institutional. She picked up. Ms. Hartwell. A man's voice. Not aggressive. Professional, careful, with the specific cadence of someone who has made many calls like this and has learned to pace the delivery for the maximum retention of the receiver's attention. My name is Agent Daniel Rice. I'm with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. Elena sat down on the edge of her mother's bed. We've had your employer under review for some time, Rice said. I want to be clear that you are not currently a subject of this investigation. You're a potential witness. I'd like to speak to a lawyer before... Of course, I'm not asking you for anything today. He paused. I'm calling as a courtesy, to let you know that the inquiry that was opened last night, and that Mr. Blackthorne apparently resolved through extra-legal means, that inquiry was not a fabrication by Carl Whitmore. It was real. It was already in progress before Whitmore approached Slade. Slade simply moved up a timeline. Elena said nothing. The file on Blackthorne Global goes back 4 years, Rice said. We've been building it carefully. Last night's events accelerated our timeline in ways that have complicated certain things. A beat. I'm not your enemy, Ms. Hartwell. I'm telling you this because women in your position have historically not been given the information they needed to make decisions about their own safety before the situation became urgent. What situation? We're moving to a formal indictment within the next 30 days, Rice said. Damien Blackthorne is going to be arrested. When that happens, everyone in his immediate professional circle will be scrutinized. Your name will be in the filing. Another pause. I'm giving you 30 days to decide which side of the line you want to be standing on. The call ended. Elena held the phone against her ear for a moment after the line went dead. The specific stillness of someone who has just been handed a piece of information that has retroactively changed the shape of everything that came before it. She lowered the phone. She looked at the wall of her mother's bedroom. The small framed photographs Margaret had hung with the particular hopeful care of someone who wanted the room to reflect something better than what happened in it. Elena's school picture at 11, gap-toothed and unaware. Margaret herself at 30, before Carl, before the managed distance and the careful composure, laughing at something outside the frame. She sat with the information. 30 days. She thought about the orchid, the salary adjustment, coffee carried from the kitchen by hand, the torn sleeve, the floor. She thought about, I want you to know before I make them. She thought about, I didn't become what hurt you. She thought about all of the small, careful, costly choices Damien Blackthorne had made over 6 months, and she lined them up against the 4-year federal file and the 30-day indictment timeline, and she tried to find the place where those two things could exist in the same frame without one of them making the other impossible. She couldn't find it. She stood up, walked to the kitchen, told her mother she had to go. Fine, she was fine, she'd call later, and went downstairs and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and looked at the street, at the ordinary morning traffic of a city that did not know or care what the last 18 hours had been. She needed to tell him. That was the first thing. She needed to tell him what Rice had said, needed to give him the information the way he had given her information, directly, without softening it, because he deserved the unpadded version and because she was not going to be the person who protected someone from a truth they had a right to. She called his number. It rang twice. Then she heard something she had never heard in 6 months, something that recalibrated every assumption she'd made about the architecture of her own understanding. She heard his voicemail message, a professional recording, clipped and expected. And underneath it, faintly in the background, before the beep, she heard 2 other voices, men's voices, overlapping, saying things she couldn't fully make out except for 3 words that arrived clearly and separately from the rest. 3 words that stopped her breathing for a full second. Deal's already done. She stood on the sidewalk. She pressed end, did not leave a message. She stood very still in the November cold with the phone in her hand and ran those 3 words through every possible context, every possible framing, every arrangement of the night's events that would make them mean something other than what they sounded like. She found one arrangement that worked. It required her to believe that Damien's resolution of the Slade situation had not been the selfless, restrained act of a man keeping a promise. It required her to believe that it had been a transaction, that the federal inquiry had not been neutralized by leverage or threat or the patient application of Damien's particular brand of controlled power, that it had been neutralized because Damien had already known it was coming, had already been in conversation with the people running it, had already made an arrangement that benefited him in ways that had nothing to do with protecting her mother or Roman's sister or any of the small, costly choices she had been cataloging for 6 months as evidence of something she was beginning to let herself believe. 3 words. Deal's already done. She had built the wall. She had felt the door. She had begun, carefully and at cost, to walk through it. And now she stood on a November sidewalk and understood, with the clean, terrible clarity of a woman who had survived her whole life by reading rooms correctly, that she might have read this one wrong from the beginning, that the patience, the orchid, the salary adjustment, the coffee carried by hand, the man sleeping on her mother's floor, all of it might have been the most sophisticated performance she had ever been given a front row seat to, and that she had started to believe it because she had wanted to. She put her phone in her pocket. She started walking. She didn't know where yet. She only knew that the direction was away, and that the woman who had hidden Bruises for 6 months and learned to survive by being very careful about where she put her trust, had just discovered that the most dangerous thing in any room was not the man who showed you the knife. It was the man who made you forget to look for. She walked for 11 blocks before she stopped. Not because she had a destination, because her body finally registered the cold, the full November cold, not the edge of it she'd been moving through, but the core of it, the kind that got into the chest and made breathing deliberate. And she stopped in front of a coffee shop she didn't know and stood with her hand on the door handle and made herself think instead of move. The problem with thinking was that it kept arriving at the same place. Deal's already done. She pushed inside, ordered coffee she didn't taste, sat at a corner table with her back to the wall. Always her back to the wall, always the seat with the clearest sightline to the exit. A habit so old she no longer noticed making the choice. And she laid it out. The federal inquiry had been real. Reese had said it was already in progress before Whitmore approached Slade. 4 years in the building. That meant Damien had known about it, or known something close to it, for some significant portion of the 6 months she'd been working 12 feet from his door. He had known, and he had said nothing, which was not, by itself, a betrayal. He owed her no confession of his legal exposure. She was his assistant, not his lawyer, not his partner. She had made the deliberate choice not to ask questions she didn't want the answers to. That had been her architecture, not his. But deals already done was different. If Damien had made an arrangement with federal investigators, if the inquiry being closed was not the result of leverage applied to Slade, but the result of a cooperation agreement, a deal that predated last night, that had been moving forward in the background of every orchid and coffee and salary adjustment and honest things said in a dim office after hours, then the question was not whether she could live with what he did. The question was whether any of it had been what it appeared to be. She sat with that question until the coffee went cold. Then her phone rang. Roman. She answered. Where are you? His voice was tight in a way Roman's voice almost never was. Coffee shop, 8th and Callaway. Don't move. A sound in the background. A door. Movement. The particular compression of a space that was not meant for conversations like this one. Damien's been picked up. The cold in her chest became something sharper. By who? Rise, federal team. Roman's breath was audible, controlled but present. They moved this morning. It wasn't supposed to happen for 30 days. That's what the filing said, but they pulled it forward. Someone told them he was a flight risk. A pause. Waited. Someone with access to the internal timeline. Elena stared at the table. He's at the federal building on Monroe, Roman said. They'll process him and set bail in the next 4 hours. I've got the lawyers moving. Another pause, and in this one she could hear something she'd never heard from Roman before. The specific sound of a man who was doing his job and afraid at the same time, and had enough self-control to keep those two things from touching. He asked me to call you. Why? Because you're the only person he asked me to call. Roman said it simply, the way Roman said everything, without decoration. I don't know what that means to you. He just said, call Elena. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. There's something else, Roman said. Tell me. The person who told Rice he was a flight risk, who moved up the timeline. Roman's voice went flat in a specific way. It was someone inside Damien's operation. Someone with clearance. The lawyers found the disclosure in the filing. It was a protected source, but the description of what they knew is... He stopped. It's someone who's been in those rooms, Elena. Someone who knew the deal he was making with Rice before anyone else did. What deal? A beat. I was cooperating, Roman said, for the last 8 months. He'd been building a case against Slade's network. Not just Slade, the whole structure, 6 families, federal level. The inquiry into Blackthorn Global was part of the cover. Made it look like he was under investigation instead of cooperating. Rice offered him a clean exit in exchange for the testimony. Elena sat very still. I was going to get out, Roman said. That was the deal. Cooperate fully, testify, and walk. The business gets restructured. The foundation becomes the primary entity. Everything else gets dissolved. Roman's voice was careful now, the way you were careful with something that could break. He's been building toward this for 8 months, and someone found out and called Rice and told them he was going to run. She thought about deals already done. She thought about what that meant if this was the deal. Not the deal she had constructed from fear and distance, and the 3 words she'd heard through a voicemail she shouldn't have heard. Not a transaction that explained away the orchid and the coffee and the floor, but the other deal. The one that cost 8 months of someone's life to build. The one that required performing a criminal empire while quietly dismantling it from the inside. The one that required not telling the woman 12 feet from your door that you were trying to become someone she wouldn't need to walk away from. Her hand on the cold coffee cup. I didn't become what hurt you. He'd said that at 5:40 in the morning with a torn sleeve and a heavy face. He'd meant it about the night. But he'd also meant it about the 8 months. About the architecture he'd been building quietly toward the moment when the answer to what are you to her wouldn't require a disclaimer about the dangerous parts. She stood up. I'm going to the federal building, she said. Elena, call the lawyers. Tell them I'm coming. Tell them I need 5 minutes with him before they do anything else. You can't get 5 minutes with Roman. Her voice came out with a quality she didn't plan. Flat and decided and done managing itself. I've spent 6 months getting into every room in that building by being the person everyone underestimates. I will get 5 minutes. She was already moving toward the door. Call the lawyers. She hung up. The federal building on Monroe was 9 blocks. She walked all 9 at a speed that kept her body warm and her mind from getting ahead of itself, which was the only speed that was useful right now. The speed of someone who had a task and was moving toward it and was not going to let the fear of what she'd find when she got there slow her down. She had been afraid her whole life. She had gotten very good at moving through fear without stopping. The lobby of the federal building was marble and fluorescent and very cold. She went to the desk and gave her name and said she was there regarding the Blackthorn processing and that she had information relevant to the detention status and needed to speak to the supervising agent. The officer looked at her for a moment. A woman in yesterday's clothes with November in her face and the particular bearing of someone who had decided before walking in that no was not an outcome she was planning around. He made a call. She waited. Rice came down himself. She hadn't expected that. He was younger than his voice, mid-40s, trim, the kind of careful that lived in the eyes and the posture. He looked at her the way federal agents looked at people they'd recently placed calls to, which was with professional interest and a complete absence of surprise. "Ms. Hartwell," he said. "You told me I had 30 days, she said. It's been 4 hours. The situation changed overnight. Someone told you he was a flight risk." Something moved in Rice's eyes. Not guilt. Something more complicated. The look of a man who is running multiple problems simultaneously and has just been informed that one of them has grown legs. "I need 5 minutes with him," Elena said. "That's not—" "You called me this morning as a courtesy," she said. "I'm here as a courtesy. I have information about the source of the flight risk disclosure." She held his gaze and did the thing she had been doing for 6 months every time Damien looked at her with the complete attention and she'd needed to hold her ground. She held completely still. 5 minutes. Rice studied her. 3 seconds. 5. 4 minutes, he said. They brought Damien to a room with a table and 2 chairs and a mirror that wasn't pretending to be anything other than what it was. He came in with his hands uncuffed, cooperating witness, not charged suspect, which meant the lawyers had already established the framework. And he looked at her across the table, and for the first time in 6 months, his face did not manage itself at all. He just looked at her. She sat down. He sat down. "Deal's already done," she said. "I heard it through your voicemail. I thought—" "I know what you thought." His voice was rough in the way of someone who had been talking to lawyers for 4 hours on no sleep. "You should have told me." "Yes. 8 months, Damien. I know. You let me sit 12 feet from your door for 6 months thinking—" She stopped. Regulated. The anger was present and real, and she was not going to let it run the room. "You let me build an understanding of your situation that was incomplete. Every decision I made was based on incomplete information. You knew that." "Yes." He said it the same way he said everything, without the padding, without the deflection, just the acknowledgement, clear and costly. "I didn't tell you because you would have left. Anyone would have left." He looked at his hands on the table, the roughness of his knuckles. "And I needed you to stay long enough to—" "To what?" He looked up. "To become something worth staying for," he said. The room was very quiet. She heard her own breathing, heard the low ambient hum of the building's systems, heard somewhere beyond the door the muffled sounds of the institution going about its work. "Someone in your operation gave you up," she said. "Told Rice you were running, moved the timeline." His jaw tightened. "I know." "Do you know who?" A pause. The specific pause of a man who does know and is deciding how much of the knowing to share. "I have a strong suspicion," he said. "Tell me." "Elena, tell me." She leaned forward slightly. 4 minutes, Damien. We don't have room for you to protect me from the information." He looked at her for a long moment. The look that was complete and direct and had nowhere to hide and wasn't trying to. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus." The security officer who had given her the chin lift every morning for 6 months. Who had told her about the harassment complaint with the careful posture of someone delivering information he hadn't been asked to deliver. Who had been in every room and heard every conversation and had been so thoroughly part of the architecture of the building that she had stopped registering him as a variable. "Why?" she said. "Because Slade got to him before I got to Slade." Damien's voice was flat. "Marcus has been feeding Slade's network for 14 months. Slade promised him a way out of the operation, a clean exit with money. When Slade went down last night, Marcus lost his exit, so he called Rice and told them I was a flight risk to blow up my deal before it closed. To retaliate, and to create enough chaos that Slade's lawyers could argue prosecutorial misconduct and get the testimony excluded. He paused. If my deal collapses, the case against Slade's network collapses with it. Everything I built for 8 months disappears. She sat with that. And you're here, she said, because Marcus knew Rice would move fast, his hands on the table, still. By the time I understood what was happening, they were at the door. A knock on the room's door, Rice's voice muffled. 60 seconds. Elena looked at Damien, at the heavy face and the torn seam composure and the man underneath the management of it, the one she'd been seeing in fragments for 6 months and seen fully for the last 12 hours. She thought about the wall, the door in the wall. She thought about her mother leaning into her shoulder in a flickering yellow hallway. She thought about what it cost to trust someone and how long it took to learn that cost and how she had spent her whole life being very careful about what she borrowed and what she was willing to pay interest on. She thought about the 8 months. She thought about to become something worth staying for. She made her decision. Tell me everything you have on Marcus, she said. Everything you know, everything you can prove. All of it. Damien went still. Elena, I managed your communications for 6 months, she said. I know where every file is. I know your calendar. I know your contacts. I know the structure of every non-disclosed arrangement in that building because I arranged the meetings that built them. She held his gaze. If Marcus is what collapses your deal, then Marcus needs to be removed from the equation before Rice acts on his information, which means I need to know what you know, and I need 40 minutes and a phone. What you're describing is, I know what it is. She said it cleanly, no trembling, no performance. Just a woman who had made a calculation and was done second-guessing the result. You have been careful for 8 months to not make me complicit in your world. I am choosing, right now, with full information, to be complicit in this one specific thing. She paused. This is different from Carl. This is not you protecting me. This is me deciding what I'm willing to do and doing it. The door opened. Rice came in, looked at both of them. Time, he said. Elena stood, looked at Rice with the bearing of someone who was done being the person receiving courtesy calls and had decided to be a different kind of variable. Agent Rice, she said, I have information regarding the source of your flight risk disclosure. The individual who contacted you this morning has a 14-month relationship with Arthur Slade's network that directly compromises the integrity of the information he provided. She paused. I'd like to discuss it. Now, before you take any further action on his disclosure. Rice looked at her. He looked at Damien. He looked back at her. Sit down, he said. She sat down. Damien watched her from across the table. The man who had spent 8 months building something and had been 3 weeks from walking out of it, who was watching the woman he loved choose to walk into it instead, and in whose face was something that was not the complete managed attention of an employer or the careful restraint of a man maintaining appropriate distance. What was in his face was something unmanaged and raw and real, the face of a man watching a door open that he had stopped believing would open. Elena put her phone on the table. Here's what I know, she said. And then Rice's desk phone rang. Not his cell. The desk unit in the corner of the room, the landline, the one that almost never rang during processing because anyone withstanding called the mobile. Rice looked at it, a flicker of something, the professional instinct that a call on that line at this moment was not coincidental, and crossed to it and answered. 2 seconds of listening. His face changed. He put the phone down and looked at Elena with the expression of a man who has just received information that has retroactively changed the geometry of the last 40 minutes. Where did you get your information about Marcus? He said. From Damien, she said, just now. Before that. He was looking at her with a new quality of attention, something sharper and more specific than the careful professional assessment he'd been running since the lobby. How did you know to come here? How did you know to ask for 5 minutes? Roman Voss called me. Roman Voss. He said the name like he was placing it. Roman Voss called you at... He looked at his watch. 8:53 this morning. Yes, Roman Voss, Rice said, with the particular slowness of a man constructing something very carefully so it wouldn't collapse, is currently in this building. He walked in 11 minutes ago with a lawyer and a hard drive, and he is sitting in room 4 asking to speak to me specifically. He paused. He says he has 14 months of communications between Marcus Drell and Arthur Slade's network. The room went very still. Elena looked at Damien. Damien looked at his hands. Not surprise, the absence of surprise. You knew, she said. You knew Roman had it. I suspected he was building it, Damien said quietly. Roman's sister, Claire. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite the usual flatness. Roman has been running his own parallel documentation since the night Slade took her, 14 months of patience. He looked up. He didn't tell me because he knew I'd tell him to stop. Too dangerous. A beat. He did it anyway. She looked at the man across the table from her and thought about patience. What it looked like as a weapon. What it looked like as a promise. What it looked like when two people aimed it at the same problem from different directions without knowing about each other and arrived at the same room at the same moment because the problem had finally run out of room to live in. Mr. Blackthorne, Rice said. He was looking at Damien with the expression of a man revising a document in real time. I think we need to restart this conversation. Damien's eyes were on Elena. She was the one who answered. Yes, she said. You do. And in the small, fluorescent room with the mirror that wasn't pretending to be anything other than what it was, she reached across the table and put her hand over Damien's hands, which were still on the table, which had been still for the entire conversation with the specific held-in stillness of a man who had been very careful for a very long time not to reach for anything he wasn't sure he was allowed to have. His hands turned over, his fingers closed around hers. Rice looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at the door. I'm going to room 4, he said. I'll be back in 15 minutes. Don't. He made a small gesture that encompassed the room, the situation, the particular precarious architecture of the last 12 hours. Just don't. He left. The door clicked shut. Damien looked at their hands on the table. Elena looked at the mirror. At herself in it, yesterday's clothes, November in her face, the particular bearing of a woman who had been moving through fear her whole life, and had arrived, finally, at a morning where the fear was still present but was no longer the loudest thing in the room. I'm angry, she said. I know. The 8 months, not telling me, all of it. I'm angry about all of it. Yes. I'm not done being angry. I'm not asking you to be. His thumb moved slightly against the back of her hand. The smallest motion. Patient as everything else about him. I'm just... He stopped. The words, for once, not arriving in their usual, certain order. I'm just glad you're here. She looked at him. At the heavy face and the rough knuckles and the man who had slept on her mother's floor and carried coffee by hand, and remembered a 2-sentence conversation about window light 8 weeks after the fact. At the man who had built 8 months of dangerous, careful work toward the specific outcome of being allowed to be something other than what he'd been made into. She thought about what her mother had said. What kind of man does that? She thought about her own answer then. I'm still figuring that out. She looked at him now and she thought, I think I've figured it out. She didn't say it yet, but she didn't have to. He could read rooms better than anyone she'd ever met. In room 4, Roman Voss was opening a hard drive. In room 1, Damien Blackthorne was holding Elena Hartwell's hand across a federal table. Outside on Monroe Street, the city moved through its November morning, indifferent and continuous, the way cities move through the private catastrophes and quiet miracles happening inside their buildings at any given moment of any given day. And in the elevator bank down the hall, the doors opened, and 2 men in suits stepped out moving fast, and one of them was Marcus Drell, who had apparently decided that the correct response to a collapsing plan was to walk directly into the building where the collapse was happening and attempt to. Marcus Drell walked 12 feet down the federal hallway before Roman stepped out of room 4. They saw each other at the same moment. The recognition was instantaneous and complete. Not surprise, Barshis on either side, but the specific locked stillness of 2 men who have been running parallel calculations and have just discovered that the calculations have converged in the same corridor at the same moment. The second man with Marcus, younger, thick through the shoulders, the posture of someone paid to be physical, took 1 step forward and stopped when Roman looked at him. Roman looked at him the way Roman looked at everything he'd already decided about. The younger man stopped. Marcus's eyes moved to the hard drive in Roman's hand. Something in his face collapsed inward, not dramatically, not with the theatrical quality of a man in a film, understanding his defeat, but with the quiet, structural failure of a man watching the thing he built to save himself become the thing that ends him. 14 months of feeding Slade. 14 months of collecting a second salary and believing the arrangement was sustainable because arrangements always felt sustainable until they stopped. Roman, Marcus said. His voice was level. The performance still reaching for purchase. Whatever you think you have, I don't think, Roman said. I documented. The hallway was very quiet. Marcus looked at the door to room 1. Elena and Damien behind it, the lawyers coming, the hard drive in Roman's hand. The younger man behind him, who was not going to be useful in this particular corridor in this particular federal building, and who was beginning to understand that. Marcus looked back at Roman. Something in his face shifted, the performance dissolving completely, leaving behind not the man Elena had watched deliver information with careful posture for 6 months, but something older and more tired, a man who had been carrying a weight for 14 months and had just understood that the carrying was over, one way or another. I need it out, Marcus said. Not a justification, just a fact offered into the hallway. Slade offered me out. I didn't have another option. You had the same option I had, Roman said. You just didn't want to pay the price. Marcus looked at the hard drive. How long? He said. Since Claire, Roman said. Since the night you told Slade where she'd be. The air in the hallway went very still. Elena had opened the door to room 1. She stood in the doorway, and she had heard it, the last sentence, the specific weight of it, and she watched Marcus Drell's face receive the information that Roman had known since the beginning, had been building 14 months of patient documentation around the specific fact of Marcus's betrayal, and had said nothing because saying something would have collapsed the case before it was built. Marcus said nothing. Roman stepped back from the doorway to room 4. A single, deliberate movement, an opening. Go in, Roman said. Marcus stood in the hallway for a long moment. The younger man behind him had already taken 2 steps back toward the elevator, recalculating his involvement and finding it insufficient to justify the room he was standing in. He kept going. The elevator dinged. Marcus walked into room 4. Roman followed him. The door closed. Rice came back to room 1 at 11:40 with the specific expression of a man who has just had his morning reorganized from the foundation up and is processing that reorganization while continuing to function, which was the expression Elena was beginning to understand that competent people wore through most of their professional lives. He sat across from them. He put a folder on the table. Roman Voss's documentation is comprehensive, he said. 14 months. Dates, communications, financial transfers, 3 recorded conversations. He paused. It's better than what we had on Slade directly. Will it hold? Damien said. It'll hold. Rice looked at him with a careful, assessing directness. The flight risk disclosure from Drell is compromised by his own documented involvement with Slade's network. It'll be set aside. He opened the folder, slid a document across the table. The original cooperation agreement stands. Your testimony combined with Voss's documentation gives us the full network. 6 families, federal level. He paused. In exchange, immunity on the legacy operations, supervised restructuring of Blackthorn Global over 18 months, full cooperation with the asset review, and he looked at Damien directly. You're done, completely. Whatever comes after the restructuring has to be clean or the agreement collapses. Damien looked at the document. I know, he said. Do you? Rice said it without aggression, genuine inquiry. The question of a man who had spent 4 years building a case against someone, and was now sitting across from that someone and trying to determine whether the person in front of him was the person the 8 months suggested, or whether 8 months was just a longer performance than most. Damien looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Yes, Damien said. He looked at Rice. I know. Rice held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he picked up a pen and slid it across the table. The formal processing took 4 hours. Elena sat in a waiting room on the 3rd floor of the federal building and drank 3 cups of bad coffee and called her mother and said she was fine and was going to explain everything later, and Margaret said fine in the way that meant she was going to hold Elena to the explanation, and Elena said she knew, and they hung up. She called no one else. She sat with the plastic chair and the fluorescent light and the institutional quiet of a building in which consequential things happened every day, and which had therefore developed an architecture designed to make consequential things feel procedural, which was either a comfort or an insult depending on where you were sitting. She sat with what she knew. Damien had been cooperating for 8 months. He had been building the case while running the business, maintaining the performance of a man who was not cooperating while quietly providing federal investigators with the documentation that would dismantle the network he'd inherited from his father and never fully believed in. He had done this alone. He had not told Roman. Roman had figured it out anyway and built his own parallel track. He had not told Elena. He had protected her from the knowledge the way he had protected her from everything else, without asking permission, without announcement, with the patient belief that the act itself was the communication. She sat with the fact that this was not a clean absolution of the things that had frustrated her. He had made unilateral decisions about what she was allowed to know. He had kept her operating in a partial reality for 6 months. He had been, in the most fundamental sense of the word, across 8 months of sustained effort, performing. She sat with that, held it honestly, did not let the outcome retroactively clean the process, and then she sat with the other thing. The 8 months of working toward a specific exit, the 14 months of Roman documenting in silence, the patience, the restraint, the costly sustained effort of two men who had both separately decided that the correct response to an unbearable situation was not the violent immediate response, but the long, grinding, expensive alternative. She thought about her mother against the wall of the apartment, about 3 years of managed distance and careful composure. She thought about what it took to hold something very still for a very long time because the alternative was worse. She understood that. In her body. She had been doing it her whole life. She understood it in Damien. She didn't forgive the omission easily. She wasn't built for easy forgiveness. That was not her architecture, had never been her architecture, and she was not going to perform easy forgiveness because the outcome had been survivable. He had made choices about her life without her. That had a cost. It would continue to have a cost. She would tell him that clearly, and he would hear it clearly, and they would both live in the honesty of that for as long as it required. But she understood. That was different. He came out at 3:15, not in handcuffs, not charged. The cooperation agreement formalized, the immunity framework established, the legal team moving in the background like a machine that had been waiting to be switched on. He walked into the waiting room in yesterday's suit with the torn shoulder seam and the face of a man who had put something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. He stopped when he saw her. She stood up. They looked at each other across the waiting room. The plastic chairs, the fluorescent light, the institutional carpet, with its careful pattern of inoffensive shapes. The city outside the building doing its afternoon thing. "You stayed," he said. "I told you to come back," she said. "I meant it." He crossed the room. He stopped 3 feet from her with the particular contained stillness that was the most characteristic thing about him. The restraint that was structural, not strategic, that had been built over time and at cost. "I owe you the unedited version," he said. "All of it. Everything I didn't tell you, when you want to hear it." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'm angry about the gaps." "Yes." "That doesn't disappear because the ending was survivable." "No," he said. "It doesn't." "I'm going to tell you when I'm angry. I'm not going to manage it. I'm asking you not to." His voice was quiet. The real quiet. "I would rather have your honest anger than your managed version of anything." She stood with that. "What happens now?" she said. 18 months of restructuring, asset review, legal oversight. At the end of it, Blackthorn Global becomes the foundation, legally and operationally. The rest gets dissolved. He paused. "I need to testify in federal court in April. After that, the immunity is clean. And the business, different business." He looked at his hands. The roughness of his knuckles, the 12-foot desk, the 6 months and the 8 months, and all the accumulated architecture of how they'd arrived at this waiting room. The charitable arm has been the only part of it I believed in for years. That becomes the whole thing. He looked up. "I want to build it into something real. Not vanity philanthropy, actual structural work. Women leaving dangerous situations, safe housing, legal support." She thought about her mother. About 3 years of managed distance in a 2-bedroom apartment with a flickering lobby light. "That's a real thing," she said. "I know." He paused. "I want you to run it." She was quiet. "Not as my assistant," he said. "As the director, your own structure, your own leadership. I'll fund it. I'll stay out of the operational decisions." A beat. "You know how to do this better than I do. You've been surviving the thing we'd be trying to fix for your entire life." She looked at him. "That's a separate conversation," she said. "That's a professional conversation with terms and a structure, and I'm not having it here." "No," he agreed. "Not here. And not until I've thought about it for more than 5 minutes." Of course. The waiting room was quiet. A woman in a gray coat walked through with a folder. The elevator dinged in the hallway. November afternoon light came through the high windows in long, angled bars, picking up the dust in the air. which was the kind of light that made even institutional spaces look briefly like something else. "Damien," she said. "Yes." "What you said to my mother this morning, when she asked what you were to me." She paused. "You said you were working on it." He looked at her, the complete look. No management, no distance. "I'm still working on it," he said, "if you'll let me keep working on it." She thought about the wall, the door, the cost of walking through it. She thought about the orchid, the floor, the torn sleeve at 5:40 in the morning. She thought about what it cost to trust someone and how the cost didn't decrease with time. It just changed shape, became something you carried differently instead of something you put down. She was not going to put it down. She was going to carry it differently. "Keep working," she said. Something moved in his face. The specific, unmanaged thing she'd been seeing in fragments for months and seeing clearly for the last 12 hours. The face of a man who had been very careful for a very long time about reaching for things he wasn't sure he was allowed to have, and who had just been told he was allowed. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Well, April arrived gray and cold, the way April in that city sometimes arrived. Winter refusing to fully cede, making a last territorial argument, the bare trees on Monroe Street still bare, when the federal courthouse opened its doors to the public gallery for the first day of testimony. Elena sat in the third row. She had debated sitting further back, had told herself that proximity was not the same as declaration, that she could be present without being visible, that the carefully maintained professional distance of 6 months had its virtues, and this was not the moment to... She sat in the third row. Damien took the stand at 9:47. He was in a dark suit that wasn't the one with the torn shoulder seam, and his hands were still on the railing of the witness stand with the same contained stillness that was so characteristic she thought she could pick him out of any room in the world by that quality alone. He looked at the lawyers. He looked at the federal prosecutor. He answered questions for 4 hours in the flat, exact, unhesitating way. He did everything. The testimony of a man who had been building this moment for 8 months and had not changed his mind about any of it. He did not look at the gallery. He knew she was there. She knew he knew. That was enough. At 2 in the afternoon, when the session broke, Roman appeared beside her in the third row. She hadn't heard him arrive, which was either a comment on his skill or on the degree of her attention. And he sat down with the solid, unhurried weight of a man who has nowhere more important to be. "How's Claire?" Elena said. "Good," he said. "She started school, graphic design." A pause. "She hated the print shop." Elena thought about 23 years old in a graphic design program and the particular freedom of an ordinary life that had almost become something else. "Good," she said. "How's your mother?" "She went back to her own apartment," Elena said. "The one she had before Carl. It's smaller. She likes it better." Roman nodded. He looked at the witness stand where the lawyers were conferring. "He's going to be all right," Roman said. Not reassurance. Statement of assessment, the way Roman stated everything. "The deal is solid. The testimony is solid." He paused. "He made the right choices." "Most of them," Elena said. Roman looked at her. A small, brief thing moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the structural suggestion. "Most of them," he agreed. The testimony concluded in 3 days. Arthur Slade was indicted on 47 counts. His network, the 6 families, the federal connections, the years of deliberate invisible architecture, came apart with the specific efficiency of something that had been built on the assumption of its own permanence and discovered too late that permanence had to be maintained. Marcus Drell pled guilty to 18 months of securities fraud and conspiracy. He sat across from Roman in a room very similar to the room where Elena had sat across from Damien, and he said, "I didn't have another option." And Roman said, "You had the same option I had." And Marcus said nothing after that, which was its own kind of answer. The restructuring of Blackthorn Global began in May. Elena sat across from Damien in what had been his office, the one with the city behind it, the one with the glass partition where the 12 feet of careful distance had lived. And they had the professional conversation with the terms and the structure that she'd told him they would have. She had notes. He had notes. Their lawyers sat at opposite ends of the table and did what lawyers did, and the thing that was built out of the conversation was a real thing, a standalone organization with its own board, its own funding structure, its own mandate, Elena's name on the executive line. She negotiated it hard. She did not do him any favors. He didn't ask her to. When the lawyers were done and packing up, she looked at him across the table and he looked at her and she said, "If you interfere in operational decisions, I will restructure the funding agreement." "I won't," he said. "I know you believe that. You'll hold me to it." "Every time," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. The first women's intake facility opened in September, a 5-story building in the Meridian district that had been a hotel in a previous life and still had the bones of it. Wide corridors, high ceilings, the sense of a building designed for temporary stays that were actually about transition, about moving from one state of being to another. Elena walked through it on opening day with a clipboard she didn't need and the specific attention she brought to every space she occupied, mapping it, noting the light, the sight lines, the exits, the places where the architecture made people feel safe or didn't. She stopped in front of one of the ground floor apartments. The window faced east. The light was good. Direct, warm, full morning. She thought about her desk on the 43rd floor. The orchid. What she'd told Damien once, in passing, in 2 sentences, about the window light. She wrote a note on her clipboard about adding plants to the common areas. Behind her, she heard him come in. She knew his footsteps, would know them in any building, any floor, any room. "Well," he said. She looked at the apartment, at the window, at the city coming through the glass in pieces. A tree, a street, a slice of sky that was an actual October blue for the first time in weeks. "It's good," she said. He came to stand beside her. Not at the 12-foot distance of a carefully maintained professional relationship, not at any calibrated remove. Just beside her, the way you stood beside someone you were with, which was its own kind of statement about what the last year had built. "The intake team starts Monday," she said. "I know. You've read the operational plan. Twice. Damien, I'm not interfering," he said. "I'm interested. Those are different things." She looked at him sideways. At the profile she'd been looking at from 12 feet for 6 months and from closer range for the 10 months since a federal waiting room in November. At the roughness of his jaw in the October afternoon light and the particular quality of his stillness, which she had spent a year reading and still found, at its edges, surprising. "You can be interested," she said. "Thank you," he said, and she could hear the specific dry weight in it, the thing that passed for his humor, which she'd taken months to identify because it never announced itself. They stood at the window. The city below was doing what cities did on ordinary October afternoons, moving, breathing, existing in its particular indifferent abundance, full of lives that were catastrophes and miracles in invisible proportion, the way lives always were. "My mother's coming on Thursday," Elena said, "to see the building." "I know. She called me." Elena looked at him. "She wanted to know if the kitchen would be stocked," he said, "for the open house. She offered to bring food." "She offered to bring food," Elena repeated. "She's making something with rice. I didn't catch the full name." Elena stood with that image. Her mother, Margaret Hartwell, 61 years old and 6 months out of the apartment where fear had lived for 3 years, calling Damien Blackthorne about rice for an open house, and felt something move through her that was not quite laughter, but lived in the same neighborhood. "She likes you," Elena said. "She tolerates me with measured skepticism," Damien said. "It's the highest approval rating I've ever had from someone's mother." This time it was laughter. Brief and real and unmanaged, the kind that came out before the composure caught up with it. He looked at her when she laughed. She'd noticed this over 10 months. The specific way he tracked the moment, the particular attention he paid to the rare occasions when the composure came down on its own. And in his face was the thing that she had stopped trying to catalog and had started simply receiving. The complete unmanaged thing, the face under the management. "Elena," he said. "Don't make a speech," she said. "I wasn't going to make a speech. You were building to something. I was going to ask you a question." She looked at him. The October light through the window, the city below, the building around them that was the thing they had built from the architecture of everything that had happened to both of them. The fear and the patience and the cost of trust and the long, grinding, expensive alternative to the immediate violent response, which was to build something instead. "Ask," she said. He looked at her with the complete, direct, unmanaged look. "Marry me," he said. Not a production. Not a performance. Just a man standing in the morning light of a building they'd made together. In a city that had tried to make them into its hardest things, asking the simplest and most honest question he knew how to ask. No speech. No elaboration, just the question. Elena looked at him. She thought about the bruises she'd hidden for 6 months, and the wall she'd built to hold everything out, and the door that had appeared in the wall without her permission, and what it had cost to walk through it. She thought about her mother's hand gripping her arm in a yellow-lit hallway, and the weight of something finally being put down. She thought about what it cost to trust someone, the real cost, the full cost, not the discounted version she'd been trying to get away with for most of her life. And she thought about how she had paid that cost now, with full information, eyes open, and found that the thing on the other side of the payment was not what she'd been braced for. It was this: the ordinary October afternoon light, the building they'd made, the man beside her who had slept on her mother's floor and carried coffee by hand and chosen, when the choice was available, to build instead of destroy. It was this. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the unmanaged face. Then he reached over and took her hand the way he'd taken it across a federal table 10 months ago, and she let him keep it the way she'd let him keep it then. Not performing anything, not managing anything, just allowing the simple fact of it to be what it was. They stood at the window. The city below moved through its October afternoon. Oh, the scars didn't go away. That was the honest version, the version without the softened edges. Elena still woke sometimes at 3 in the morning with her hand at her collar. Margaret still had moments, in new rooms, of the old managed distance coming up before she could redirect it. Damien still made unilateral decisions occasionally, still caught himself halfway through them, and stopped and said, "I should have asked you," with the specific directness of a man keeping a promise to himself, which was different from the man who hadn't thought to ask. The work of it was ongoing. It did not end at the window. But the work was different now. The work was the kind that built something instead of the kind that just survived something. The kind where the cost was real, but the thing you were building with it was also real. And you could look at it on an ordinary October afternoon and see it standing there in the light. The foundation grew. Elena hired 12 staff in the first year, 22 in the second. She was in the building at 7 most mornings and sometimes at midnight, and she was the kind of director that the people who worked for her described as demanding, in the way that meant she expected the work to matter as much to everyone else as it mattered to her. And it mostly did. Roman came on as head of building security at the Meridian facility. He was good at it in the way he was good at everything, with the patient, unhurried thoroughness of a man who understood that the work was in the details and who had never needed to be told that twice. Claire came to the open house in October and brought a poster she'd designed, the foundation's logo, which Elena had sketched on a coffee shop napkin and Claire had made into something real. Margaret brought the rice dish. It turned out to be something she'd learned from Elena's grandmother and hadn't made in 20 years. And Elena stood in the common kitchen of the Meridian building and watched her mother move through the space with the ease of someone who had begun to learn, at 61, what it felt like to be in a room that wasn't organized around someone else's anger, and she thought, this is also what it was for, not just the building, not just the foundation, this. Her mother in the kitchen, the ordinary ease of it. Some years later, not many, but enough, Elena stood on the terrace of a building that had stopped being just an office and had started being a home. The city spread out in the morning light below her, and she thought about the bruises she'd hidden for 6 months, and the wall she'd built over a lifetime, and the door that had appeared in it without permission, and she thought about whether she would change any of it if she could. The honest answer was complicated. She would change the bruises. She would change her mother's 3 years. She would change the 14 months Roman had spent building a case in silence while carrying the weight of what Marcus had done to Claire. She would not change the things that had made her who she was in the room where it mattered. The patience, the attention, the ability to read a room before the room knew it was being read, the specific knowledge carried in the body of what it cost to survive something and what it cost to build something, and the difference between those two costs. She would not change having learned the difference. Damien came out onto the terrace behind her. She heard his footsteps, still the footsteps of a man who had never needed to rush, still the measured and unhurried walk, but with something different in the weight of them now, a lightness that had been earned rather than performed. He came to stand beside her, the city below, the morning light. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're thinking," he said. "Always," she said. "About anything in particular?" She thought about what to say. about the bruises and the wall and the door and her mother in the kitchen and Roman's sister with the poster and all the accumulated architecture of how they'd arrived at this terrace on this morning, in this city that had tried to make them into its hardest things and had made them, instead, into this. About what it cost, she said. I was quiet. He understood the question underneath the statement. He had always been good at the question. Underneath the statement, it was one of the first things she'd cataloged about him, and one of the last things she'd expected to be grateful for. Was it worth it? He said. She looked at the city, at the morning, at the man beside her who had chosen, when the choice was available, to build. Ask me in 20 years, she said. He looked at her with the unmanaged face. The corner of his mouth moved. I can do that, he said, and the city moved through its morning below them, indifferent and continuous, and full of its invisible lives, and the light came through the way it came through on the best mornings, direct and unhurried. The kind that didn't flatter or conceal but simply illuminated, showing everything as it actually was. Which was, in the end, enough. More than enough. It was everything.